continue to reward Israel by resuming and or kickstarting new cooperation and trade agreements with complete and deliberate oversight of human rights and international law. This is something we see, for example, in recent days in the resumption of the EU-Israel Association Council Agreement. In addition, and despite the relative progress in the pursuit of accountability, truth, and justice for the Palestinian people at multiple international mechanisms, including at the United Nations Human Rights Council with the creation of an open-ended commission of inquiry in May 2021, for example, and with the International Criminal Court's opening an investigation respecting the situation in Palestine, we have also witnessed political bias, double standards, reluctancy, and active efforts by some states, primarily from the global north, to sabotage, block such efforts, thereby not only undermining Palestinians' right to truth, remedy, and justice, but also undermining the validity and integrity of international law and its associated instruments. It is therefore important to hear from practitioners and their experiences in other similar contexts, like in Myanmar and Syria, to consider lessons learned and to draw on some practical recommendations for the way forward in achieving justice and accountability for the Palestinian people, which would naturally contribute to Palestinian rights and liberation, but also to the progression of the international legal order. So this is our subject of discussion today among our distinguished and esteemed speakers and commentator. As for the structure of the panel, we have an overall 90 minutes. Following this introduction, I will immediately give the floor to the panelists and commentators who will speak for about 45 minutes in total. We will then move on to the question and answer section for about 30 minutes. And during that section, I encourage you to share your questions, comments with the panelists in the box, in the chat box, or you can raise your hand to request to take the floor to speak. Before I turn to our first speaker, I would just like to ask that you please be reminded to speak slowly and briefly when you take the floor so as to help our interpreters throughout the event. And the second request is that if you are not, if you're not taking the floor, please mute your microphones. Moving on to start with this discussion, I would like to give the floor to Chris Gunness, founder and director of the Myanmar Accountability Project. Chris will speak to us about the pursuit of accountability in the context of Myanmar in the next 10 minutes. Chris, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Rania, and thank you to Law for Palestine and ARDD for inviting me. I should also add to Maha's introduction that I, prior to this, was also the spokesperson and head of public advocacy for UNRWA and worked in Gaza, the West Bank, Palestine, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. And it's interesting for me, having done this work on Myanmar, to look back and reflect on my time in Palestine. So more of that anon. What I thought it would be useful to do would be to explain how MAP, the Myanmar Accountability Project, which I now direct, was set up, why it was set up, what it does, and perhaps to reflect through that experience on some lessons learned for the Palestinian context. So after the military coup, a failed military coup in Myanmar on the 1st of February last year, those of us engaged in Myanmar were in a state of shock and panic. Although the coup was very largely predicted, it suddenly turned on its head. It upended the international engagement with Myanmar, which was premised on the idea of long-term development, that there would be this working government between Aung San Suu Kyi and the military. Suddenly that wasn't going to happen. Humanitarian aid amid a worsening human rights and other crises is what the international community needed to do. So I and a group of lawyers, I, full disclosure, am not a lawyer, sat down and did what we call a mapping exercise. And we looked at what people were doing, what was being done, what wasn't being done. And it quickly became clear that an organization exclusively dedicated to accountability, to universal jurisdiction cases, to bringing cases in national jurisdictions for crimes committed by the junta, international crimes committed by the junta since the coup, was something that was lacking. So we set up MAP, and we very quickly found ourselves with 5 cases. We went around the world looking for jurisdictions where, first of all, there was a legal way forward that was possible. That was the first prerequisite. And secondly, where there was a conducive political environment. And those 2 things, I think, are very important, and I think they feed off each other. So today we have a case in Istanbul, a torture case, a crimes against humanity case. We have accused 23 members of the junta because of issues about state immunity. We don't know the extent to which state immunity starts at the top and goes to the bottom. It's unclear. We have accused 23 members of the Tatmadaw, the Burmese army, some very senior, some very junior, of torture against a client. We are lucky in the sense that someone defected from the torture center where our client was tortured. So we have prima facie evidence against the actual torturers, but also against senior people in the regime. That case has been accepted by the Chief Prosecutor's Office in Istanbul, and it has been sent to the Justice Ministry in Ankara, who are now investigating the evidence we presented with a view to making a determination about whether we move to an actual trial. Secondly, we have a case in London where, after the coup, the ambassador in London to Myanmar was ousted. He was locked out of the embassy, and the regime's agents in London then attempted to throw him out of his house. It so happened that he then went to the lawyers who I was working with in MAP to ask for defense. And we have effectively turned a dispute about the Vienna Convention, the diplomatic convention, into a dispute about a property. And we have written to the junta several times, and we've made it clear that the English Property Registry lists the Union of Myanmar as the owner of the property. We've explained to them that they do not represent the Union of Myanmar. Their coup is unconstitutional and illegal. We've explained to them that if you want to evict somebody from a house in the UK, you have to go to your local county court, obtain an eviction notice, and then go to the police and ask them to implement that eviction notice. And we've explained to them that the British government and all of Britain's major allies condemned the coup and have slapped sanctions on, and they will not be able to take this property back. And they, for the time being, have backed down. So again, we're using the jurisdiction, we're using the law in London to delegitimize and, frankly, through the press, to demonize as far as we can this illegitimate junta. We have also, under Article 15 of the Rome Statute, sent a case to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Again, it was a question of providing the evidence of torture against a named individual, and then providing the legal analysis to show that it meets, that torture meets the threshold of international crimes, that in the words of the Rome Statute, this practice is widespread and systematic. Our case has been, the Article 15 submission has been accepted by the court, and we wait, and there are developments around the ICC which I'd like to come back to. We also have a case in Paris, which we are at the moment drawing up the legal opinion. Thousands of documents came in after the coup, were brought over by a senior military figure who defected. And they are evidence that the sanctions which the European Union has imposed against the junta are being violated. And we are working on a case against the chief executive of Total, which is a French oil giant, which has since the early 90s extracted gas from a gas field off the coast of Myanmar. But what we're hoping to establish through this case is the legal precedent that if you work with an illegal junta that's violating international law, you become complicit in their crimes. And that's important because at a time when there's a huge campaign to sanction and to disinvest from Myanmar, other companies are simply coming in to fill the gap. And by establishing this legal precedent, we're making it very clear that anyone else who comes in to fill the gap is also complicit in these crimes. Very finally, we have a case in Jakarta. Now, as I went around the world trying to find jurisdictions to take our cases against the junta to, I was told time and time again that unless the perpetrators stand a chance of being present in the jurisdiction, then the National Prosecution Services will be reluctant to take action. At that point, a light bulb went off in my head. The ASEAN Secretariat, the Secretariat of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is in Jakarta, and junta officials go there all the time. So this week we have petitioned the Constitutional Court in Jakarta, and at the moment extraterritorial cases are not permitted, but we are petitioning them to allow a case where both the perpetrator is from Myanmar and the victim is from Myanmar to be heard in Indonesia. The politics are good because next year Indonesia assumes the chairmanship of ASEAN, and people are going to be looking to Indonesia to take action. As I say, both the politics and the law have to work for you in these cases. And very lastly, before I shut up, and I will do very shortly, I promise, as well as that legal work, MAP does another big tranche of work, which is public advocacy. And here we have two main tranches of work. One is around the United Nations, where there is a disputed credentials claim. So both the junta and the National Unity Government have submitted credentials to be credentialed in the General Assembly. We commissioned a legal opinion around this, which looked at previous precedents, which effectively found that increasingly effective control is less important, and what matters more and more as the UN General Assembly makes its determination about credentials is A, democratic credentials, and B, human rights observation. Last year, we managed to get the junta's credentials rejected, and the General Assembly voted to allow the National Unity Government ambassador, the NUG ambassador, a man called Chomotun, to stay in his seat. And the indications that we are getting now from New York is that we have won a similar victory this year, and that the junta is probably not going to be allowed into the General Assembly. That's pretty much a given, and that the NUG ambassador will again be allowed to occupy the chair for Myanmar. But we have to have that properly confirmed. And the other thing we're working on is a proper state referral to the ICC, to the International Criminal Court. Again, we commissioned a long and substantial legal analysis which looked at the Article 12.3 declaration by the National Unity Government, effectively saying that they accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC. As far as we're concerned, the precondition for jurisdiction has now been met, and we are lobbying various member states, state parties to their own statute, to refer Myanmar to the ICC, at which case we're in business, we hope, and the ICC might be moved, as it was with Ukraine, to move to an investigation. Very lastly, to say that I look back at my time at UNRWA and I think, why on earth did we not, as a body of human beings, not just the UN, but others, simply look for these sources, these routes to justice and accountability for the Palestinians? UNRWA is sitting on a whole bunch of prima facie evidence. We had emails with COGAT, the people who impose the blockade of Gaza. This is an illegal collective punishment, a grave breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention, a war crime. We know their names, we know their ranks, we know what they're doing. They sent us in UNRWA emails about what they were imposing, what we weren't and weren't allowed in. That's just one example, I think, when I look back at my time at UNRWA, and I think in the light of all the work that we're doing on Myanmar, where there are big powers standing in the way, principally Russia and China, but in spite of that, things are going on, and Kyaw will tell us more about work in the ICJ and the ICC. It's not all good news, but as I say, the lesson I take from comparing the work we've been doing in Myanmar and my time in Palestine is why, oh why, did we miss all those opportunities? There are answers which perhaps we can explore in the Q&A. Maha, at that point, I'll hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this inspiring intervention, showcasing the work of MAP and the different avenues that you have been using to achieve accountability. And your questions at the end are very valid, and I think many of us share similar questions. Why didn't we use them, or why have they failed so far despite the relative progress? Without taking much more time, we will hear now from Fadel AbdulGhany, the founder and head of the Syrian Network for Human Rights, and who will share with us and shed light on the Syrian experience in the pursuit of accountability and justice at different international, regional, and national levels. Fadel, please, you have the floor for the next 10 minutes.
شكرا مها، وشكرا على التنظيم وعلى الدعوة، وبتشرف إنه يعني يكون بيناتكم. يعني بدي أحكي بس على المستوى أكثر الاستراتيجي وفوت شوي بس بالتفاصيل. بالبداية يعني نحن كل تقدم بسيط عم نعتبره إنجاز، فعم نقول إنه هذا أحسن من ما يكون في تقدم بالمرة. لكن يعني الأمور هي ما لها هيك، بدنا نشوف ليش. هلأ بسوريا في عدة آليات أممية، في لجنة تحقيق دولية، في الآلية كمان آلية التحقيق المستقلة اللي أنشأتها الجمعية العامة بنهاية 2016، واللي بتسمى اختصاراً بالتربل IM. وأيضاً في ولايات أخرى يعني توسعت، ولاية منظمة حظر الأسلحة الكيميائية وما إلى ذلك. هلأ يعني بدنا نحكي يعني عن بشكل خاص يعني هون عن يعني المحاكمات الجنائية وعن الولاية القضائية العالمية بشكل خاص. يعني الولاية القضائية العالمية أو القانون الجنائي للدول، هاي المحاكمات اللي عم تصير. بعتقد إنه نحن التجربة السورية علمتنا أو عم تعلمنا إنه في بالحقيقة تيارين هن السائدين. تيار عم يرفع سقف التوقعات أو رفع سقف التوقعات بشكل كبير كتير، بعدين أدرك خطأه، وهذا لاحظناه بشكل فج بسنوات 2017 و2018. هذا رفع سقف التوقعات شو بيعني وشو بيعمل؟ لما نرفع سقف التوقعات عند الضحايا، فشو بيصير؟ في إنجازات تحتها ما حدا بيعود بيطلع ولا بيكترث فيها. وقت بنقول هاي الدعاوى راح تؤدي لمحاسبة النظام، لإيقاف التعذيب، وراح تؤدي إنه ترهبهم، ومن هذا الكلام الكبير، فبتصفي الإنجازات اللي تحتها، وهي إنجازات حقيقية وجيدة، ما بيعود إلها قيمة. التيار الآخر هو بعتقد إنه بشكل كبير هو رد فعل على هذا التيار اللي هو عم يقلل من قيمة هاي المحاكمات. بعتقد إنه لازم يكون في تيار وسطي، لا نرفعها كتير وهيك عم ينظر لها كمان من خارج دول أخرى. صار إنه هي إنجازات خارقة، وخاصة إنه عم يتم تغطيتها من قبل وسائل الإعلام. شفنا محكمة كوبلنز فين صارت بالتغطية، ومش من قبل مختصين، وما عم تنظر لإطار عام، عم تنظر بس لمحكمة كوبلنز. خلينا هلأ نحن جايين نحكي يعني أكثر من منظور بحثي. خلينا نحط كوبلنز ضمن حجمها، ضمن إطارها، ضمن سياقها. مثل ما بنعرف كلياتنا إنه أصلاً الدور اللي فيها تلعبه الولاية القضائية العالمية والمحاكم الوطنية اللي عندها اختصاص بمحاكمة الجرائم الفظيعة ضد الإنسانية والحرب أو الإبادة، هي دور بالأصل محدود. هي بالأصل محدودة، لأنه أغلب الدول هي بتشترط تواجد المجرمين على أراضيها. هذا أغلب قوانين الدول بالحقيقة. هلا في دول أكثر مرونة من غيرها مثل ألمانيا والنرويج، اللي هي بتسمح لك إنه تبدأ بالتحقيق إذا كان المجرم على الأراضي. ما بدي أدخل بالتفاصيل القانونية كتير، بس إنه يعني إذا من بدايتها هي محدودة، فما بدنا نرفع نحن سقف التوقعات. نحن بالحقيقة عملنا دراسة، قلنا خلينا نشوف شو هي الأحكام اللي طلعت من هي الدعاوى اللي رفعت. وبالمناسبة زملاء وزميلات، مثل ما بنعرف كمان والمادة 1 باتفاقيات جنيف المشتركة إنه محاربة الجرائم، الحرب ضد الإنسانية هي مسؤولية كل الدول، ولهيك دائما في توصيات دائما إنه يكون في تضمينها بالقوانين الوطنية، وفي دول كتير مضمنتها بالقوانين الوطنية. بالرغم من هيك بسوريا وفلسطين بميانمار بمختلف الدول، هاي الدول ما عم تتحرك بالحقيقة، أو عم تتحرك بشكل محدود جدا. هذا الأمر هو موجود ضمن ولاياتها القانونية. بسوريا هاي الدول عمليا تحركت. نعرف النظام السوري ارتكب جرائم ضد الإنسانية من 2011، يعني كان فيها تحرك بال 2011، أو هذا وفق تقرير اللي طالعته المفوضية السامية لحقوق الإنسان بأيلول 2011. وبعدين لجنة التحقيق طالع التقرير الأول بشهر 11 2011، وكمان اتهمت نظام جرائم ضد الإنسانية. لكن هاي الدول هي تحركت بال 2014 و2015 بالبداية. طيب خلينا نشوف، يعني فإذا تأخرت كل هاي السنوات لحتى تحركت بالولاية القضائية العالمية. مجمل الأحكام اللي صدرت، هلأ ما بدي أحكي بالدعاوى الموجودة، لا خلينا نحكي بالأحكام بالنتائج. في 29 حكم صدر بحق يعني مجرمين حرب أو مجرمين ضد الإنسانية. خلينا نحللهم. 22 حكم من أصل 29 ضد تنظيمات متطرفة، يعني بده تهم بالإرهاب، وهذا مثل ما بنعرف هو أسهل شيء، تهمة تلبيس التهم بالإرهاب. 13 تهمة ضد عناصر بتنظيم داعش، و8 تهم ضد جبهة النصرة المرتبطة بالقاعدة، وواحد ضد تنظيم جند الشام، كمان هو تنظيم متطرف. يعني 22 حكم من أصل 29. 4 ضد فصائل المعارضة، يعني صرنا 26 حكم. 3 فقط ضد النظام السوري. طب إذا نحن بدنا نجي نحلل خريطة مرتكبي الانتهاكات بسوريا، بنلاقي إنه النظام مرتكب النسبة الأعلى 85% من الانتهاكات. المفروض هذا الشيء ينعكس على الدعاوى اللي تقام، وينعكس يعني إذا ما كان بهي النسبة ولكن يعني بنسبة قريبة. هلا الدول اللي أصدرت الأحكام: ألمانيا بتتصدر الدول ب20 حكم صدر منها، هولندا 4، السويد 4، بلغاريا حكم 1. وفيني اجي على تفاصيل هي الأحكام، بس ما في داعي، أنا التقرير راح يصدر قريبا وراح أشاركه معكم، ومشان يعني نضبط الوقت أكثر، لهيك حابب أحكي بهي النقاط الأساسية البارزة. النقطة تبع بدي انتقل على محاكمة كوبلينز، اللي هي أخذت الصدى الكبير بسوريا. ومثل ما بنعرف حاسب يعني صدر حكم بحق أنور رسلان. في سبب إنه هذا أول قضية كانت أخذت هذا الزخم في عدة أسباب، لأنه هي إنه هذا الشخص محسوب على النظام السوري، ولهيك أخذت هي الصدى. بنعرف نحن إنه وحتى أنور هو يعني إنه طلع من النظام وقال إنه أنا انشقيت، أو حتى إياد غريب، هدول الاثنين من أصل 3 دعاوى اللي هن تحاكموا ضد النظام السوري، إنه هن منشقين عن النظام. بس بالرغم من هيك كمان خلينا نشوف وليش نحن ما لازم نرفع سقف التوقعات، إنه هدول هن رتب يعني كثير منخفضة ضمن منظومة النظام نفسها، وما هم من صناع القرار. ويعني ما بيأثروا على النظام بولا شيء. وأنا حكيت عن الآليات الموجودة، هي الآليات كلها آليات المحاسبة بما فيها الولاية القضائية، هي يعني ما بتردع هي الأنظمة المتوحشة، ما بترجع أنظمة ديكتاتورية، هي ما غير مكترثة بسمعتها. يعني تم إدانة النظام من قبل أعلى الهيئات الأممية والتي تسمى الجيم، الآلية المشتركة، الميكانيزم اللي أنشأ قرار مجلس الأمن 2235 بآب 2015، وأصدرت 3 تقارير وأدانت نظام باستخدام الأسلحة الكيميائية. فهو لا يكترث بهي السمعة. فكل هي الآليات هي ما نجحت بأنه النظام يتوقف عن الإفلات من العقاب. طيب، وكمان ما بدنا يعني نحن، بدي انتقل على الضفة الأخرى هلأ. يعني ليش كل هاي الأسباب ما بتدعينا أنه نحن نرفع سقف التوقعات؟ لا، نحن هون عم نخاطب الضحايا وعندنا مسؤولية كبرى، ولازم نكون كتير واضحين وكتير شفافين، وهذا غلط كبير بالسياق السوري لازم الكل يتعلم منه. بدي انتقل على الشق الثاني. هل هذا يعني أنه نحن ما نبذل جهد بهي المحاكمات؟ ما نبذل جهد مع هي الهيئات الأممية؟ طبعا لا. الجواب هو إلا ما كلش نحن موجودين. بدنا نقول إنه هي الخيارات المحدودة الوحيدة اللي قدامنا، إنه نتعاون مع لجان التحقيق، نتعاون. نحن عندنا اتفاقيات مع كل لجان ونتعاون معها ونعطيها البيانات، ولازم نتعاون معها. هي الخيار الموجود قدامنا، ما في خيارات أخرى. ولكن بدنا نقول إنه هي قاصرة، لكن أيضا عندها جوانب إيجابية هائلة أيضا. من أبرزها، إذا بدي أحكي كمان، بدي أقتصر بالحديث عن المحاكمات، ممكن أحكي عن الآليات الأخرى وجوانبها وقديش هي يعني مهمة لموضوع المحاسبة، من ضمنها موضوع المحاسبة. لكن خليني أحكي عن كوبلينز تحديدا وقديش مهمة. شفنا نحن التغطية اللي حظيت فيها. أيضا إدانة كوبلينز هي صحيح أدانة فرد لأنه هي محكمة جنائية، بس هذا الفرد هو جزء من منظومة، ونحن قرينا الحكم كله، والحكم قال جرائم ضد الإنسانية، والجرائم ضد الإنسانية ما بيرتكبها فرد، هي منظومة دولة. إذن هي بنفس الوقت تحمل إدانة للنظام نفسه، اللي كان أنور عم يشتغل جزء منه. أيضا نفس الشيء مع إياد غريب، نفس الشيء الدكتور اللي ما صدر الحكم اللي بفرانكفورت المحكمة، دكتور نحن بنقول له المسالخ البشرية، يعني هو عار على الطب، علاء الدين موسى. شو التهم اللي موجهة الادعاء العام له؟ أيضا تهم بارتكاب جرائم ضد الإنسانية، يعني عم يتهم المنظومة كلها. ومن هون بتنبع أهميتها بالحقيقة، أو هي من أبرز سمات الأهمية، إنه عم تشكل إدانة للنظام، عم تسلط الضوء على القضية السورية، عم تم تحييها، عم تؤدي إنه النظام مو بسهولة بيتم ربط علاقات معه. هذا نظام متوحش، عم تخلي العلاقات مقطوعة معه سياسيا وتفرض، والعقوبات تتم مستمرة. في كثير من المبررات لدى المشرعين ولدى السياسيين إنه هن ما يعيدوا العلاقات، يعني عندها فوائد سياسية واقتصادية وحتى على صعيد المحاسبة هائل. لكن هي ما رح ما بدي ارجع على الشق الاول، انه ما رح تعمل اللي ذكرتهم. لهيك هذا اللي انا بمداخلتي حبيت ركز عليه. هاي ابرز فائده يا زملاء وزميلات ممكن نحن ننقل لكم اياها. طبعا في كثير فوائد اخرى وفي حكي طويل، انا اخذت كثير يعني صار من الوقت، بعتذر. لكن اذا بدي انقل لكم شغله، بدي انقل هاي الرساله، يعني رساله محدوده، الكلمه ما بتتسع، انه او الكتابه اللي كتبتها ما بتتسع لاكثر من رساله اساسيه واحده. وبتشكركم كثير على اتاحه الفرصه، وانا جاهز لاي اسئله بالنقاش.
شكرا كثير لك فضل. Thank you very much Fadel. Sorry for the interpreters. I'll resume in English. And thank you for this insightful intervention on the basis of your experience, and particularly with the issue of managing expectations of victims when we're approaching such mechanisms and avenues. I will now move on to our third speaker, and right before we hear from our commentators right after, we have Kingsley Abbott, the Director of Global Accountability and International Justice at the International Commission of Jurists, the ICJ, and who will speak to us about the different approaches, available instruments and initiatives to achieving accountability relevant to such contexts. Kingsley, you have the floor, and please be reminded that you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maha. I'll set my timer to make sure I stick to time. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this important discussion. I also plan to speak slowly because I know the interpreters have a very difficult job, and I thank them for helping me out. I've been asked to say a few words on the big picture of international justice and to touch on some of the lessons that can be learned from Myanmar, which is a country that I have worked on now since about 2014, but the International Commission of Jurists has worked on from a human rights and rule of law perspective since the 1950s. And I want to focus a little bit on what we're discussing here today with our Palestinian friends, which is what are some elements or some reasons for hope? What are some similarities and lessons? And I think I'll begin by saying it's often first important to reflect on the fact that international criminal justice is still a relatively new endeavor. And many would say that the fact it even exists at all is a little extraordinary. In some ways, we are still in the very early days. I think what's important, and one element that gives us all hope, is that international criminal justice is still evolving and has shown a capacity for finding creative solutions for what look like hopeless situations in certain cases. And as it happens, Myanmar is a very good example of that. And I'll talk more about this later. But I think it's also important to acknowledge at the beginning that international criminal justice is also imperfect. It's sometimes politicized. It can be expensive and time-consuming, which understandably causes frustrations for victims all over the world, where impunity remains the norm rather than the exception. I think just a few words on international justice. As we know, the modern international criminal justice system, as we know, had its origins in 1945 at the end of World War II. And in Germany and Japan, the Allies, UK, Russia, the US and France tried German and Japanese leaders for their crimes. But there wasn't a lot of progress after World War II for another 50 years or so because of the Cold War. It was really at the end of the Cold War in 1989 that a new dynamic area of international justice started, which wasn't that long ago. And we saw in the early 1990s, for example, the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and importantly, in 1998, the International Criminal Court's founding treaty, the Rome Statute, was adopted and entered into force in 2002. What's significant about the International Criminal Court is that it's the first and only permanent treaty-based international criminal court. But there are also significant challenges there. One of them is that key states are not members, such as the US, China, India, Russia. And so we haven't yet achieved universal ratification of the Rome Statute. So the 1990s was a really interesting time in multilateral cooperation, and academics and people working on international justice sometimes ask themselves, wow, it was a miracle that we managed to create those tribunals and the International Criminal Court back then, would we even be able to do it today in 2022, given the state of international multilateral cooperation? And there were also other courts, Sierra Leone, East Timor, and two where I worked. I was a prosecutor at the Special Tribunal for Lebanon in The Hague and a senior legal advisor in Cambodia. And I think that takes us up into today. And today, despite all of this work, I want to emphasize that we are still combating impunity for serious human rights violations around the world. And without accountability for these violations, all these mechanisms that we've developed in international laws, human rights law, international criminal law, without accountability, it's meaningless because victims of violations and abuses are denied justice. My reason for setting all this out and to say that this is still a new endeavor is to signal some hope for our friends from Palestine, because the system is still evolving, the architecture is still being added to. And I think I'll use Myanmar as an example as to why there's still hope. And some of the things I'll talk about with respect to Myanmar will resonate with our friends from Palestine. And I am not an expert on the Palestinian situation, but I think I can already sense that there are some parallels that are relevant to victims anywhere in the world. Just to say a few words about Myanmar, because I'm not sure how familiar you are, but in 2016 and 2017, another appalling cycle of violence broke out in Rakhine State, the home of the Rohingya, with the army conducting what they call clearance operations, which resulted in hundreds of thousands of Rohingya being forced across the border into Bangladesh, where nearly 1 million now live there in camps in appalling conditions. And it's not just the Rohingya who've been victims of violations in Myanmar. For years, other ethnic minorities have also been victims of atrocities. And as my friend Chris was referring to, the fact that just last year there was a military coup where now the whole population of Myanmar is essentially targeted. And individuals within the army, as Chris was saying, are now accused of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. My point is that back in 2016 and 2017, when we were getting together looking at opportunities for justice, the situation looked very grim. It looked almost impossible. And that the Myanmar situation highlighted the gaps that still exist in the international justice architecture. There were no credible investigations in Myanmar. Because Myanmar had not ratified the Rome Statute, there was no ICC investigation. The UN Security Council was so politicized that the Myanmar situation wasn't referred to the International Criminal Court. No other investigations were taking place, and there was no universal jurisdiction cases underway. But then suddenly, all within a short space of time, through the creative work of lawyers, civil society, and victims groups, we now have an ICC investigation into crimes committed where part of the crime is committed in Bangladesh, which is a state party to the ICC. The Gambia has brought a case before the International Court of Justice alleging Myanmar violated the Genocide Convention. The UN Human Rights Council has created a mechanism to collect evidence of violations all over the country since 2011 and on an ongoing basis. Several universal jurisdiction cases have been launched around the world, and other litigation is being pursued, including against Facebook, for example, for failing to take adequate steps to combat hate speech on its platform. So within just the space of a few years, there was an enormous amount of accountability efforts that were identified and implemented around the world when just months earlier, there was nothing. And I think there are some parallels to be drawn or some lessons to be learned. One is that, first of all, there's a need for reliable evidence. All of those processes need evidence. Civil society is gathering evidence, ethnic groups, UN experts, international NGOs, and others. And I would just like to talk about 6 key developments or trends which are relevant to your work and relevant to the situation in Palestine that I see when I look from a very big picture, bird's eye view. First of all, we're now seeing a new generation of UN body mechanisms which are conducting investigations and collecting evidence for use in accountability processes. We're seeing them for Myanmar, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Israel, Russia, Ukraine, South Sudan. We're also seeing a rise of civil society groups or specialist NGOs and human rights defenders who are conducting more accountability-focused investigations. It's a new generation of civil society groups that are focused on collecting evidence for use in criminal and other legal proceedings. In terms of forums to use this evidence, because it's no good to have evidence but to have nowhere to use it, we're seeing also the increasing use of universal jurisdiction. The ICC can't do it all. So we need to find countries around the world which are able to hold independent, impartial, and credible, fair trials so that perpetrators can be prosecuted outside of the International Criminal Court. We're seeing legal innovation at the International Criminal Court, like the Myanmar case. We're seeing legal innovation in the use of the International Court of Justice, like the Gambia against Myanmar case, the Ukraine and Russia case. And we're seeing legal innovation in other settings seeking redress, corporate accountability, civil cases. For example, the case brought by the Rohingya against Facebook. So what have we learned so far? I think, just to finish, we've learned the power of civil society groups, victims groups, and lawyers to find creative ways of collecting evidence and ensuring that there are forums for accountability. Secondly, we've really learned the need to collect and preserve evidence that can be used in accountability proceedings as soon after the violations have been committed as possible. We've seen legal innovation in order to open up other avenues, not only at the ICC and the ICJ, but also in domestic courts. And I think there is another lesson we've learned, which is the need to keep hope about accountability, but also to be realistic about the time that sometimes takes. And I'll finish by saying that one of the reasons to strike a note of hope is that just a few days ago in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal finished, having found several former leaders of the Khmer Rouge guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And this happened decades after those violations happened. And when I joined the court in 2007, literally helicopters had picked up these elderly defendants from their villages where they would have felt for decades a sense of impunity, that they were untouchable, that they would never face justice. They were picked up by helicopters and brought to a prison facility right outside the window of my office where they faced justice. It took decades, but they did end up facing justice. And what that teaches us is that while a situation often seems hopeless, with time, things can change. They can change politically. They can change when new accountability opportunities are opened up. And so I think looking down at the full international justice and accountability framework, there are certain trends we are seeing in Myanmar and other places, which I think are important to identify for you who are seeking accountability in your own situation. Thank you. Thanks, Maha.
Thank you very much for not only sticking to the time, but also striking the notion of hope for accountability and an end to impunity in the context of Palestine, and also by doing it by providing very practical and technical steps, building on previous cases or ongoing proceedings that you have worked with. Thanks a lot for that, Kingsley. Now that we have heard from Chris, Fadel, and Kingsley, I'm keen to introduce and hear from our commentators who will share with us their reflections and their insights, also building on their experiences and in individual and collective efforts in pursuing accountability and justice in the different contexts where they come from or work on, i.e. Myanmar and Palestine, respectively. And our first commentator is Kyaw. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, because I didn't earlier. And he's the founder and director of the Burma Human Rights Network, BHRN. Please go ahead. You have 5 minutes to share your comments.
Hi, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. And thank you, Maha, for giving me the opportunity. I'm very much agreeing my previous speakers, my colleagues like Chris and like Kingsley, and they have mentioned very important important points about the international legal system, which is also part of the politics. You know, it is very difficult to pursue. But the key point here is keep hope. And I think it is important for the people on the ground. You have a ground documentation network. That's what BHRN started. You know, we make sure that every crime the military has been committing, military or anyone, whoever committing, will be recorded. You know, we try our best to document all the first thing we make it one monitoring team. This monitoring team monitor on the human rights violation across the country. Our BHR and Burma Human Rights Network mainly focus on Muslim issues, Muslim minorities, because in Burma there are 6 Muslim groups. Rohingya is one of them. So we monitoring and we focusing on their human rights and their situations, and we document them. And the next thing is we employ some researchers and we document them, and we save those information very safely and very economically, very systematically, and then we have some researchers who conduct the research and bring some kind of important findings from this research, the policy, the state policy, and the crime, the pattern of the crime, how they're committing the crimes, you know, and also we have established alliance between different minorities, different religious groups, different ethnic groups. And one of the things I'm very proud of is civil society in Burma is very united, it's very strong. You know, we are working very closely in Burma. So it is a very diverse community. They are, you know, a very diverse community we have. So civil society in Burma is very strong, and also we face a lot of challenges, but it operates very effectively. So we have also researchers bring those important things, and we publish the research, our research report, thematic report from time to time. And also we have a lobbying and advocacy network. So we travel around the world and we meet with the government and we show them, we prove them, right? What we're talking about is not just verbally. We have evidence-based advocacy, which is very important. And we don't try to make it as a religious problem. This is not a religious problem, right? In Burma issues, right? This is the military. They want to make sure their power exists. They control the power. They protect their economic interest in order to make sure they create religious problems. They create problem between the ethnic group, between the different religious groups, between minorities. So divide and rule strategy they apply. And they even, you know, exploited their own religion with Buddhism and created a lot of proxy institutions. And through this proxy institution, they spread the hate speech. And through this hate speech, they create some kind of violence against the Muslim minority. And then they never punish them. They have impunity, and they keep repeating that. The circle of this violence is repeated again and again all the time. Whenever they need it, they can create it. So also they have a state policy as well, the genocidal policy. And I hopefully very soon we can publish that report as well. We have been conducting research since 3 years. You know, we are collecting evidence, all the stages of genocide and how much this genocide are very systematically, you know, operating inside the country, and how much the government institutions are established and ready to deliver those targets whenever they need it. So these are the very interesting reports. So what my suggestion is, need a lot of reports like that to give the idea to the international community what kind of strategy and what kind of patterns are there, you know, to prove that internationally what we can do. And also one reality is you need to see that the international geopolitical situation, like IIM exists in Syria case and Burma case right now. And if you look at that, the reality is because if you want to approach ICC case or any international legal system, you need to have a 5 Security Council country to support that, to agree on that. And it is not possible right now. They are divided, right? So that is the one reason why the IIM came to exist in Syria and Burma cases. and through this channel, we are now collecting a lot of information, but I don't know when the case will be filed to ICC or anywhere else. But also there another opportunity that you can continuously seeking universal jurisdiction, that like MEP is doing. Every country they are reaching out. It's an amazing job they're doing. So we are really impressed. That's a really impressive job that we're doing. So that's another option we can pursue. But the point is, the outcome will be anything one day. You don't know. We never expected the ICJ will come to exist for Burma case, right? It's happening now. So the point is, you need to do your job the best. Keep hoping that one day we will get our justice. But you never give up that, oh, there will be any justice for us, so it is useless to collect this data. No, you have to keep collecting. That's our job for the human rights. And the important thing for the human rights work is, you cannot just differentiate who commit the crime. This could be your own people, your own government, your own people who you support could commit human rights violations. It should be recorded as well. It should be documented as well. So that will give you the credibility on your human rights work. And human rights is a very important work that it should be, shouldn't align with any political background or any state, because those who violated human rights norms should be documented, that they are the people who need to be brought to justice. That is very important principle. I think we should have. And I think I completed 5 minutes. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for these insightful and practical recommendations and reflections that you have shared with us, also for reigniting hope in the minds and hearts of many of us here who are gradually losing that hope. I would like to move on to our second and last commentator / speaker, Ronia Modi, who served as the representative of Fadel to UN institutions in Geneva and to EU institutions in Brussels between 2008 until recently, and has had many different affiliations as well. Ronia, we look forward to hear your reflections and comments in the next 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maha. Thanks for everybody. I'm so really happy to hear the expertise of all the speakers, and I think I have some questions came to my mind, especially about Myanmar and other issues, because this is bring me to the idea that why is there, unwilling or unable the international community failure to hold Israel accountable. So this is what we don't understand, why this ongoing violation in the OPT continued. In spite of all the resolutions and all the commissions of inquiry, either independent or the last even commission, in which we call it ongoing commission, which is similar to other commission. So this is bring us to the question, why the UN bodies until now unable to follow, to continue to achieve. Is it normal that after more than 74 years, that until now, violations continued? The Israeli continued, and even now, it's became more hard for the population. I don't want to do a speech about the situation in the ground, because I felt that everybody know very well. Especially, I was very much inspired after Chris' intervention, because my question is why now we are optimistic about Myanmar, but we are not, or we was unable to achieve anything when it comes to the Palestinian issue. So it's, in fact, there is no basis in international law for denying Israeli establishing, like the last decision, as Jerusalem as a capital. I think that the United Nations and its different bodies as institution for global governance are particularly responsible about this situation. Serious engagement with new operational and conceptual framing of the conflict that has accountability, justice, and equality at its core principles. This is not normal that all these continued every year, and I think Maha was included when we attend item 7. Every time we have new issues to bring, every time we got great resolutions. And if I give you just the voting for countries in favor or against, you will be surprised. It's become more and more countries are non-involved when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So this is, I will give you just one example about the one resolution about ensuring accountability and justice for all violations of international law in the OPT, including East Jerusalem. And how many times among the UN recommendations to call to report on the implementation of the resolution. This example, this resolution, it was in 2019. Can you imagine that just 14 countries vote in favor and many others are against? In spite that all these countries, I mean, of course, the countries that are member of the Human Rights Council, because it's not just all countries. And they are the same like Fiji, Czech Republic, Bahama, Austria, Bulgaria, Brazil, Ukraine, Hungary, and Australia. And when we tried to lobby them, unfortunately, we couldn't achieve anything. As well, the EU, if I want to bring also the EU, I lobbied the EU since 2006, I'm sorry. And how many times the EU itself, I mean, urges Israel, urges investigation into Israeli murder for Palestinians or house demolitions or other issues. But unfortunately, nothing happened to improve the situation in the ground. And I was happy to read the letter of the Amnesty International just Friday addressed to Borrell, in which they asked that the negotiation or the committee, which is Israeli-EU Human Rights Committee, that should really continue their work because unfortunately, many issues happened in the ground, and just what we hear from the EU, it's just, you know, condemning these violations. I remember once I addressed to the EU representative when it comes of their voting against a resolution which was really about house demolitions in for El Araqib, which is the Bedouin structure, the Israeli call it. And he told me, it was outside the UN. He said, you know, I received by SMS the way how I should vote, which is mean as a lawyer, he doesn't have even the liberty to explain. This is what I understand from him, that he doesn't have even the right to explain or to vote against the decision of the EU. Which I understand that now we have to leave the UN and we have to go directly to the EU institutions or the government. So my question again, why until now the international community, when it comes to Palestine, to the conflict Israel-Palestine, I mean, it's like they don't want to hear anything. I understand, maybe they are tired, maybe they don't want to go anymore for this issue. And why when it comes to other conflict, it's all the international community moves very quickly. And this is remind me of what happened when the war started between Russia and Ukraine. I remember the number of refugees, we have them in Switzerland. I host even one of them, but I remember how much we had problem in order to help any other refugee. I'm not talking just about Palestinian refugees. I can bring to your attention many other refugees because I work in one organization which work for migrants, IOM, International Organization for Migrations. And you can't imagine how much it's hard really to save one case. And by the time we see sometimes some countries, I mean, they are able to accept many hundreds. So I don't know, how we can really hold Israel accountable by conducting independent, transparent, and impartial investigation, by moving from the UN to the EU, how many resolutions we have. I want to remind you just some cases in which I work hardly. One lawyer, and he's a Palestinian French, and he was held in administrative detention. We try a lot with the French government. It's impossible to move when it comes, because he was arrested by, he was held in Israel. Another case, a Lebanese guy, his name is George Brahim Abdullah. He was held, he was subject for 30 years in prison, and now since 36 years, and he's still in arrest. So I don't know how we can explain to the young students or lawyers that one day we will achieve justice when we saw some European countries, they are unable even to respect their constitutions or the conventions they sign. And here I want to come, because we speak about accountability. I remember how many members of the PLO in the past years were killed either in Italy or in France. But until now, we don't know, we don't have any information about accountability or where arrived their cases. And the last one was in Bulgaria, Omar al-Nayef, before maybe 7 or 6 years. Until now, absolutely no achievement. So my question, do we still have to believe of law? Of course, I believe. But the other question, how we can still achieve justice for victims, and also when it comes accountability for, how we can hold Israel accountable with all these violations. It's a shame for the international community. And I feel really ashamed when I want to do any action. And until now, we achieve absolutely, I can say, nothing. It's very few things, but in the ground, the situation continue to become more and more hard for the population. People start to leave. And here I want just to bring one example, because somebody bring the issue of the UNRWA. Before 3 days, a boat carried, migrants from Lebanon, among them Palestinians, and many of them have been killed. The others, we are still looking. Why? Because we can't imagine that until now, since 74 years, and the situation of the Palestinians in Lebanon are became more and more hard, of course, comparing to others. I don't want to compare them to Lebanese, but I can compare them to the situation of Palestinian refugees in other countries. So now we have many questions to answer, and I think I'm among the people that we have to look to answer these questions. Otherwise, we will meet again and again, and we will have absolutely no answers to all these questions. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I take more time.
Thank you very much, Rania, and thank you for raising these questions, but also shedding light on the discrepancy and the double standards and the selectivity that plays a role into the application of international law. Sadly, in the case of Palestine, very evidently so. And as you and Chris have highlighted, that this continues to be a trend over the decades, and it definitely allows for perpetrators to continue with their violations without any accountability, without any end in sight. But once again, I would like to thank our speakers, our commentators, for such rich content and such important reflections and practical and inspirational points that you have raised so far. It has been really invaluable to hear from you all. And I would like to give the chance to the audience to be able to engage with you, with the experts, ask them questions, share their own relevant reflections and or experiences. Maybe Rania has already posed a couple of questions. I propose that we see what we get from the floor first as well, and compile a round of 3 questions at a time for our speakers to answer. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is for the audience. If you would like to ask a question, you can either put it in the chat or Q&A box in Zoom, or you can raise your hand to request the floor. You're more than welcome to make an oral intervention in English and or Arabic. But again, please be mindful that your questions and comments are concise, brief, clear, so we can accommodate as many as possible. We only have 15 minutes left. So let me see. We have one hand raised, Hassan bin Amran, and then Lex. Please, Hassan, go ahead.
Thank you, Maha, and thank you to the speakers and commentators. My name is Hassan bin Amran. I'm a board member at Law for Palestine. I actually had two questions, but Rania kind of covered the one related to the lack of political will, the one that we saw in Ukraine, partially in Syria and Myanmar, but we did not see in the case of Palestine, which was a serious challenge. So besides that point, I wanted to ask Chris regarding the UNRWA evidence and how that can help in the efforts of accountability for Palestine. Are there practical examples, or are there certain source of evidence that is still available at the disposal?
Yeah, I mean, Lex could chip in on this as well, because he's been in the agency for many, many years, longer than I have. I was only there for 15 years. When I was in UNRWA, I remember thinking, there are various accusations you can make against the Israelis. A lot of them related, for example, to determinations about, for example, the attacks on Gaza. And there were questions about, were Hamas in the building? Were Hamas not in the building? There were all these gray areas which were very much up for dispute. But there were two areas which struck me as being beyond any dispute. One was the settlements, which are an absolute, not just are they a violation of international law, you have Israeli politicians being elected on a platform of building settlements and justifying settlements. So if you need to improve intentionality and you need the evidence, just Google settlements and Israeli establishment, and you've got all the prima facie evidence you need. And the other major area was the blockade of Gaza, which is very clear. You don't have to have an argument about was the Hamas this and, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff, which the Israelis always, they always trump everybody on because they've got the best technology and the best spy equipment in the world and all that. The blockade of Gaza is simply a black and white case. There is a blockade. We know exactly who is imposing it. It's called COGAT. They have a website. We know who's in charge of COGAT. UNRWA and many others have emails explaining. We had the so-called red lines document. Some of you may remember years ago when the Israelis did this sort of Nazi-esque calculation about how many calories people need in Gaza and how that translates to truckloads. I mean, worthy of, Goering and Himmler. But they published this proudly. So it's not as if with those two areas, settlements and the blockade, we're short of evidence. So the question for me is, why on earth has nobody used this? I don't know the answer. I mean, one answer is cowardice. It will take a lot of guts from somebody within the UN, an UNRWA Commissioner General, or indeed the Secretary General, because this would be escalated by the Israeli Perm Rep, to the Israeli Prime Minister, and there'd be a huge, great sort of diplomatic hissy fit, and Israel would throw its toys out the pram and make all sorts of threats. And of course, because Israel is the spoilt child of the international community, gets away literally with murder. So I mean, that's the problem. I mean, the evidence is there. It's sitting around in UN inboxes and other people have it. The intentionality is provable. It's all there. It just takes the courage and the political will of someone to get off their backsides and initiate a case. Look for where there are routes to justice. That's what we did in MAP. I went around the world investigating where we could bring cases, where it was possible. And we've now got today 4 cases, possibly 5. So, it's perfectly doable. The evidence is there. I would suggest that it's the blockade of Gaza, the collective punishment, which is an illegal. Collective punishment is illegal. It's it's a crime for which it's an international crime. And the other one is settlement expansion. The Fourth Geneva Convention does not allow populations to be transferred in and out of occupied territory. So there we have it, Hassan. If anybody wants to do it, they can, but they would need courage if it's to come from within the UN system. And I mean, and the question to answer Rania's question is, she asked, why has nothing been done? Why is there this huge disparity? It's because of politics. And because of politics, Israel controls the narrative. And it's very hard to get beyond that control of the narrative and that control of politics. All I would say, and it picks up on what both my friend Chowin and also my friend Kingsley have said, is although this big picture stuff, is important, do what you are doing. Don't focus. In Palestine, the big picture is so depressing and so debilitating. Don't think about the politics. Find your case, find the evidence, find the jurisdiction, find the court, find the lawyers, and just get on with it. Don't look at the bigger picture. Don't listen to all the noise around in the big picture. Get on with your 2 or 3 cases and don't get distracted.
Thank you very much for your prompt response, Chris. Does any other speaker would like to make any comment with regards to the question posed? Or, yeah, Lex, please go ahead.
Lex, you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to all the speakers, and I just wanted to interject also with respect to Chris's last comments. I mean, in all fairness to the Palestinian, to the state of Palestine, they have included the settlement issue and the blockade in Gaza in their referral of the situation in Palestine to the ICC. And after a lot of toing and froing, a formal investigation is ongoing. What we're witnessing today is sort of very little concrete action by the ICC. Similarly, there have been efforts at pursuing Palestinian cases through universal jurisdiction. Not enough. One of the reasons I suggested to my friends in both ARDD and Lawful Palestine to invite you is that I was very intrigued by using sort of sympathetic jurisdictions like Turkey, like Indonesia, and there may be others. I think that
Argentina, they will do a trial in absentia. Yeah, get someone to go. One of these Palestinian lawyers on this panel should go and talk to the lawyers in Argentina, where there's a brilliant Rohingya case. Already the Rohingyas are having their day in court in Argentina. Okay, so you're not going to get any members of the Tribunal going to Buenos Aires, but part of what we're doing in MAP is using the noise around the case to delegitimize and demonize the Myanmar junta, to sort of shut them down.
That's sort of my question to you. I mean, I think in terms of the legal work, a lot is happening with respect to Palestine and a lot of very good quality stuff. And one of the things why it's such a pleasure to work with Lawful Palestine is that these are a group of young Palestinian lawyers with a lot of energy, with a lot of professionalism. You see that through the way these webinars, for example, organized with simultaneous translation, with live streaming on important networks, and their ability to further mobilize young Palestinian and other Arab and international lawyers to sort of work on justice. I think one of the things that is not sufficiently happening is what you're doing as a public advocacy expert in making the noise, as you said, making the noise around the cases. And I'm just wondering what advice you may have for Lawful Palestine, for ARDD on sort of stepping that up, on making sure there is so much noise that the prosecutor of the ICC and national prosecutors in cases of universal jurisdiction, cannot afford not to notice, not to pursue the cases.
I mean, Lex, one answer to that question is that the noise you make around something has to be credible. And what makes it credible is that it's rooted in a legal process. And I mean, Kingsley is as an expert in this, is better placed to answer this question. But, I think it's important to find a jurisdiction where there can be a credible case. I said Argentina because there's this, it's clear that Argentina is a very good jurisdiction. It's been very profitable for Myanmar. But once you've got a case, for example, is opened against, an Israeli official, whatever it might be, in Argentina, you can go to the races at that point, because you've got a case around which to base a whole load of really interesting public advocacy. So my first advice would be find a really good jurisdiction. You know, the ICC and the international legal mechanisms, I mean, you know, as Kingsley said, you know, there's many reasons for hope, but the fact is that the case is very slow at the ICJ, not least thanks to Aung San Suu Kyi. And, you know, we're having a lot of trouble pushing a state party to do a referral to the ICC in relation to Myanmar. And, you know, as Rania said, it's very frustrating when you see what happened for Ukraine. But, you know, find the jurisdiction, get the case going, and then around that, you can do a whole load of really credible advocacy.
Thank you so much, Chris and Lex, for this exchange. I'm just mindful of the time, and we have 2 questions in addition to Ronia has her hand raised. So let me start by sharing the first question that was sent via the chat. And it's from Hannah, and she would like to ask the following. What is the prospect for Palestinian civil society to pursue any form of documentation or evidence collecting regarding Palestine, given Israel's recent wave of attacks against the 6 Palestinian civil society organizations, including Al-Haq? I think this is a very valid and important question, considering what has been going on, including the raids and the closure of these 6 + 1, 7 organizations in the past few weeks. Maybe we can take Ihsan's question, and then Rania, if it's a question, please take the floor to ask it. If not, then we can give 1 minute, 1 minute each to the speakers to give an answer and final round of comments, if that's okay with everybody. Ihsan, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Maha. Thanks for the distinguished speakers and commentators. So in 1 minute, since we are talking about accountability with regard to Syria and Myanmar and lessons learned for Palestine, my question is, are the cases of, let's say, success with regard to Syria and Myanmar, although limited, are related to uncontrollable factors, such as the political interests and perhaps the absence of a firm block on accountability there, as in the case of Palestine? Or is this actually due to objective factor that must be taken into consideration by those working on litigation on Palestine? And if it is so, what are those objective factors? Thank you.
Thank you, Ihsan. Maybe we can start with Rania and then move back to the list of speakers in that order. Please go ahead, Rania.
Okay, sorry. Okay, combating impunity is a must. Accountability contributes to a broader sense of justice, I mean, to victims. Again, I heard Chris, he said, because it's politicized, I mean, all the, let's say, not the UN bodies, but I mean, why we can't achieve justice until now, especially, as I said, with my experience, more than 15 years with the EU institutions. So do you mean that we have to work far away from the UN, but to use all the UN mechanisms in order to disturb or to achieve justice for victims? Maybe it's a simple question, but really because we lost time, and with all these resolutions fill in the drawers, but in fact, in the ground, the situation is became more and more really hard.
Thank you, Rania. Another very important question. Kyaw, would you like to jump in and give your final remarks, or if you have answers to the questions posed? 1 minute, please.
Yes, as far as I want to say that it is very crucial that you don't see, you know that the situation in politicizing the legal matters in justice, you know, justice means it becomes national interest of the country when it becomes obstacles for the justice. So the point is we have to work out in some way, but having said that, you cannot give up what we are collecting data and you know, collecting evidences. No matter what happens, it will work one day. you need to keep doing this, and that's a very important job. You're collecting the legal evidences, as well as Chris Alia said, that how the politicians are demonizing the community, and use media effectively. That's very important. Let the international community know what's going on. And this is the time of media. You don't need to ask any journalist to do that. You can do yourself. A lot of things you can do, especially the young people who can use the social media very effectively. Please use those things, to reach your justice, to get your justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I give the floor to Fadel now, and then Kingsley, and then Chris for final remarks or answers.
شكرا إحسان على السؤال، وهو سؤال معقد يعني يعني بده إجابة طويلة، بس باختصار لا، هو الاثنين صديقي إحسان بالحقيقة. يعني التحدي الأبرز خليني أقول إنه المتورطين الكبار بالانتهاكات ما رح يجوا على هاي الدول، مثل ما ذكرنا إنه هي بتشترط وجود مرتكب الانتهاكات على الأراضي، فما رح يعني هن ليش بدهم يسافروا على دول عندها اختصاص قضائي عالمي؟ يعني بيروح على دول مارقة، يعني حتى إذا بده يعني يروح سياحة أو ما إلى ذلك. يعني هذا التحدي الأبرز، يعني بروح فنزويلا، بروح كوبا، بروح إيران، بروح يعني دول ما عندهاش. هلا الأمر الآخر، وهذا صار هون نقاش، إنه نحن عندنا إمكانيات محدودة، هل نوظفها ونلاحق أشخاص هن من يعني متورطين من قبل النظام السوري، ولا إنه لا نسخر، لأنه إمكانيات محدودة كل إمكانيات المؤسسات اللوجستيكية، ولا إنه لا نلاحق الكل، ولا مين ما إجا هذا اللي لقينا خلينا نضب فيه رتبته صغيرة رتبته كبيرة. يعني فهذا النقاش يعني بيستحق التوسع فيه، وأثرت نقطة يعني غاية في الأهمية، وهذا صار بالسياق السوري.
Shukran, Fadel. Thank you. Kingsley just wrote to us saying that he had to leave sharp. So I think we can move to Chris in case you have any final remarks, or if you'd like to answer the question regarding civil society and the attacks against them in a minute or a minute and a half. Thanks.
Sure. Just very quickly on the question of evidence, this was a massive problem in Myanmar, because you literally had people being shot. You lifted up a mobile phone to take a picture and you'd be shot dead. So although what's being done against Al-Haq-Adullah, all these other organizations, is appalling and condemnable, we had the same problem in Myanmar. There are organizations outside Myanmar, international organizations, often associated with big universities, who have the capacity to help support, collect, store, analyze, and deal with evidence to send it to the right people. So that box has definitely been ticked, despite the Israelis can do what they will do what they will do to Palestinian civil society organizations, but there are groups outside that will definitely help Palestinian groups collect and store evidence. On the question, which Hassan, a very excellent question, I think, about how much is it about luck and how much is it effective about politics, judgment, whatever. I would say that you have to find the right legal mechanism in the right jurisdiction, and then ignore all the politics and just pursue it relentlessly and make a lot of noise around that, and don't engage with people who will call you all sorts of bad things. Carry on doing what you do and believe in it. Because I agree with what both Jowin and others have said on this panel, Kingsley, that there are grounds for optimism. You just need to do what you're doing in a single-handed manner and do it courageously and not be intimidated. Because if you look at the big picture, you'll get depressed. It'll be debilitating. Look at what's in front of you. Do it incredibly well. And one day Palestinians will have justice. There will be accountability. Palestinians will have their day in court, and they will have the dignity which they have been deprived of for so long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are about 3 or 4 minutes over time, so we must wrap up, also because we can't keep our interpreters much longer than this, I believe. Just a quick wrap up and summary based on the brilliant interventions we heard today. Important to keep the hope alive, important to keep documenting, collecting evidence, and moving forward and exploring new avenues. Things don't stay the same. There will be new opportunities. There will be new availabilities and openings for us to pursue accountability internationally, domestically, regionally. We need to keep an eye. Also important to manage expectations of victims and of people involved in the proceedings and in different avenues and mechanisms as well. And I think we could stop here. Once again, thank you very much to our distinguished speakers and commentators. It has been really a pleasant and insightful and inspirational conversation this evening. Thank you as well to all the participants, to the members of Jurists for Palestine Forum, and of course, a big and warm thank you to the interpreters, to Noor, Malik, and everyone else in the tech team, without whom this session would not have been accessible to all of us. It was a pleasure to moderate this panel, and I wish you all a good evening. يعطيكم العافية وشكرا.
Thank you to you, Maha. Great moderation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.